O Lord, I feel the weight so strong. My feet been dragging all day long. Post-emancipation Virginia. When the Civil War concluded in 1865, Virginia existed as a land filled with contradictions. Richmond, having served as the Confederacy's capital, bore battle scars and deep divisions between black aspirations for freedom and white opposition to change. The Emancipation Proclamation alongside the 13th Amendment guaranteed liberty. However, a different reality unfolded throughout the countryside. For countless newly emancipated individuals, the aspiration for independence faced immediate challenges from laws and practices crafted to maintain their attachment to the land. Freedmen throughout Virginia encountered black codes, regulations restricting their movement, employment options, and even household arrangements. Numerous individuals were compelled into inequitable arrangements with previous enslavers, agreements they lacked ability to read or bargain over, ensnaring them in endless poverty. Land remained unavailable, and prospects in Richmond and neighboring counties like Henrico and Chesterfield stayed minimal. Certain black households attempted relocating to urban areas, yet others stayed behind on plantations, trusting pledges of payment that seldom materialized. Throughout 1865 to 1870, white property owners adapted to losing legalized enslavement by establishing systems of concealed domination. Though the state seemed to progress during Reconstruction, covert webs of exploitation persisted, particularly on remote farms merely several miles beyond Richmond. These years established the groundwork for a harsh truth: servitude under different labels, maintained through quiet and obscurity. Hidden farms and isolated plantations. Beyond Richmond's expanding city streets, the Virginia countryside remained an area where time appeared motionless. Throughout 1871, farms scattered through counties such as Hanover and Goochland became prisons lacking walls. Here, black households were secretly held, their labor stolen under protection of remoteness and quiet. Unlike the grand plantations from before the war, these properties were modest farming operations, frequently hidden from inspectors or union representatives. White landowners asserted these families had chosen to remain. However, a harsher reality existed. Many never received permission to depart. Their movements were restricted through intimidation of violence. Their dwellings were simple timber shacks with dirt floors, constructed behind fields or deep within woods, distant from primary thoroughfares. Youngsters matured believing themselves attached to the property, never knowing existence beyond the farm boundaries. Within Richmond, newspapers celebrated advancement. However, less than 20 miles distant, an alternative narrative unfolded. Farmers avoided scrutiny by representing themselves as struggling homesteaders while secretly keeping entire households as uncompensated laborers. Black males plowed tobacco and corn fields. Females prepared meals and performed domestic duties for the household, while youngsters were dispatched to collect firewood or tend animals, all while under continuous surveillance. These farms represented places of terror and quiet. No documents recorded the identities of those confined there, and neighbors seldom discussed it. Seclusion served as the perfect instrument. Deprived of connection to churches, educational institutions, or legal systems, households existed in captivity long after legislation had pronounced them liberated. Manipulation of debt and labor. Across numerous Virginia farms in the early 1870s, white landowners perfected a system appearing legitimate yet functioning as disguised enslavement. They informed black households that liberty carried costs. Provisions, housing, or implements were never provided without charge. Every loaf of bread, every borrowed plow was documented as indebtedness. Landowners claimed these families accumulated obligations beyond their capacity to settle, binding them to endless work. Throughout counties surrounding Richmond, debt represented the invisible chain. Agreements frequently appeared on documents filled with legal terminology that freed individuals could not interpret. Even when wage promises were extended, year's end delivered disappointment. The account books consistently revealed obligations exceeding earnings. Families questioning these calculations encountered threats: depart, and the sheriff would apprehend you for vagrancy, or more severe consequences, men carrying whips would arrive after dark. Youngsters as young as 8 were informed they must labor to assist settling the family's debt, removing weeds from tobacco fields or transporting water beneath the intense Virginia sun. Females prepared meals in the landowner's kitchen or laundered clothing for the household, yet were informed their efforts counted for nothing against the supposed balance due. This manipulation aimed to eliminate hope. Multiple generations of black men and women found themselves trapped in poverty cycles mirroring the bonds of slavery. Superficially, Virginia farms appeared lawful. Yet behind the figures and ledgers existed a system as brutal as slavery itself. Children born into captivity. By 1871, a fresh generation was already developing in concealed bondage. On isolated farms near Richmond, black children entered a life that ought not have existed. Though legislation declared them free at delivery, actually they inherited their parents' captivity. They never witnessed a schoolroom, never acquired reading ability, and never envisioned existence beyond the fields where they worked. From the instant they could walk, children received assignments. A 4-year-old might transport small firewood bundles. By age 6, they could chase poultry or draw water from wells. At 8 or 9, they joined grown-ups in fields, removing weeds, collecting vegetables, or tending animals. Their early years weren't characterized by recreation, but by the rhythm of compelled work. Landowners regarded them as property, not as youngsters. When visitors approached, these boys and girls were concealed inside cabins or instructed to pretend they were household servants. Fear silenced them. Parents, themselves imprisoned, could only murmur about freedom, yet were powerless to alter their children's destiny. The lack of education was intentional. While educational institutions for freed individuals were opening in Richmond through churches and the Freedmen's Bureau, those in hidden captivity had no opportunity to attend. The mere concept of a child acquiring reading ability was viewed as threatening. Thus, entire households stayed in ignorance. Their stories erased before they could even be documented. In Virginia's heart, less than 10 years after emancipation, children were still being raised as slaves in all but designation. The role of violence and fear. Violence represented the unspoken law keeping black families imprisoned on Virginia farms in 1871. Even without legal ownership, landowners employed fear as their most powerful weapon. Whips, chains, and firearms stayed visible reminders of potential consequences if someone attempted escape. Night riders, groups of armed men patrolling rural areas, frequently targeted freed individuals who discussed leaving. Their presence ensured quiet remained the sole safe choice. Families lived under continual threats. A father questioning unfair debts might be beaten before his children. A mother declining extra household work hours could be locked inside a shed without food. Children were warned that disobedience would bring punishment not merely for themselves, but for their entire family. This system of collective suffering guaranteed nobody dared resist. Local sheriffs in counties near Richmond frequently ignored the situation. Many had been former Confederates, unwilling to defend freedmen's rights. Complaints made to authorities vanished in silence, or worse, brought retaliation against those who dared speak. Law existed on paper, yet justice seldom reached the fields and cabins where hidden slavery persisted. Fear exceeded physical pain. It represented psychological domination. The constant possibility of violence created a world where men, women, and children lived in submission. They learned to conceal their anger, keep their dreams unexpressed, and survive day by day under cruelty's shadow. Richmond as a divided city. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. In the early 1870s, Richmond presented itself as a city of advancement. The war had concluded. New enterprises opened, and black churches and schools emerged in growing numbers. On Broad Street and near Shockoe Bottom, freed individuals assembled to establish communities, attend worship, and instruct their children. Newspapers printed articles celebrating emancipation and Reconstruction's promise. However, the image of freedom in the city represented a fragile mask. Just beyond its boundaries in counties like Henrico and Hanover, farms still confined families in hidden bondage. While the urban center discussed opportunity, the countryside whispered of captivity. Richmond became emblematic of two Virginias, one advancing toward modernity, the other clinging to slavery's shadows. Black leaders in the city labored tirelessly assisting freed families with adjustment. Churches organized schools and groups like the Colored Men's Conventions demanded civil rights. Yet, even within Richmond, racism ran deep. Numerous white citizens declined hiring black workers for fair wages, and violence frequently erupted in alleys or marketplaces. The contrast was striking. In the same city where children recited lessons in freedmen's schools, merely 10 or 15 miles distant, other children remained hidden in cabins, compelled into labor without education. Richmond stood as a location of hope and hypocrisy, progress and denial. For families imprisoned on nearby farms, the city's lights were visible at night, yet its promise stayed unreachable. Richmond's divided reality mirrored Virginia's larger truth. Freedom was declared, yet bondage lingered still, concealed just beyond sight. Whispers among the freedmen. By 1871, whispers of hidden slavery traveled quietly among freed individuals living in and around Richmond. In black neighborhoods near Shockoe Bottom or at church gatherings along Broad Street, stories circulated about families still imprisoned on nearby farms. These rumors were spoken in hushed tones, passed person to person, never too loudly for fear of attracting attention from hostile ears. Some freed individuals had relatives who vanished after the war, never coming back to the city. Others heard accounts from peddlers or traveling preachers who visited rural counties like Goochland or Powhatan. They described black men plowing fields under watch, women scrubbing floors in farmhouses, and children never seen in schools. These accounts seemed unbelievable. Yet the pain in the voices relating them made them impossible to dismiss. Fear kept numerous individuals silent. Exposing such practices meant risking retaliation from powerful landowners and their allies in law enforcement. The Ku Klux Klan and other groups of night riders had already terrorized freedmen's communities, burning churches and attacking leaders demanding equality. Speaking too openly about secret slavery was seen as inviting danger not merely for oneself but for the entire community. Still, whispers carried hope. Churches became safe spaces where information circulated discreetly. Leaders quietly documented, and some started planning methods to record these abuses. Though fragile and hidden, these murmurs formed the initial steps toward uncovering what lurked in Virginia's countryside shadows. Testimonies of escapes. Despite the heavy chains of fear, a few families managed to break free from secret bondage. In 1871, escapes reached black churches in Richmond, carrying stories that shocked even those who had survived slavery's worst years. Exhausted and malnourished, they spoke of farms where freedom was a lie and where violence kept them tied to the land. One man fleeing from Hanover County described how he had been promised wages after the war. But each year his debts increased. He worked sunrise to sunset in tobacco fields. Yet at every season's end, he owed more than before. His wife and children were held as collateral, making escape nearly impossible. When he finally reached Richmond, he begged church elders for protection, fearing landowners would attempt reclaiming him. Women's testimonies exposed another cruel reality. Some described being forced to cook and clean in white households while their own children labored outside. Others told of punishments inflicted on their children if they slowed in fields. Tears marked their words, but relief showed in their voices as they finally spoke truth. Church leaders listened carefully, documenting farm names and counties, though always with caution. These testimonies were dangerous. If word spread too quickly, escapees risked being hunted. Still, their courage planted seeds of action. In Richmond's sacred spaces, survivor stories transformed whispers into undeniable evidence, pushing truth closer to light, growing awareness in 1871. By the year 1871, the silence surrounding hidden slavery in Virginia began fracturing. Activists, journalists, and church leaders in Richmond started connecting whispers with escapee testimonies. At community gatherings, elders recounted names of families who had disappeared, and young men rode into rural counties to verify stories. What they found left no doubt. Slavery had not truly ended for everyone. The awareness spread slowly but steadily. Articles in local black newspapers hinted at abuses, careful not to expose too much for fear of violent backlash. In Colored Men's Convention meetings, delegates discussed false contracts and freedmen's imprisonment under unjust vagrancy laws. Behind these words lay the reality of families imprisoned on farms merely miles outside Richmond's expanding neighborhoods. In churches, ministers used sermons to remind congregations that freedom remained incomplete. They described how justice required more than paper laws. It required vigilance and courage. Meanwhile, freedmen's school teachers instructed children to carry truth back to parents, encouraging questions about relatives still missing. Even sympathetic white allies began noticing. Some Reconstruction officials heard rumors and quietly investigated, though many feared challenging powerful landowners. The year 1871 became a turning point. The moment when hidden stories could no longer be contained within whispers. Secrecy's veil was thinning and truth was preparing to step into openness. Historical silence and memory. Despite the awareness growing in Richmond and surrounding counties, much of Virginia's hidden slavery story never entered official records. Families experiencing it often carried memories in silence, fearing shame or retaliation. For decades, their suffering existed only in oral accounts, whispered to children and grandchildren as warnings of what the world could still do to them. In Richmond's public narrative, the city celebrated advancement. Schools, churches, and businesses became symbols of Black resilience. Yet behind this celebration lay the unspoken truth that freedom had not reached every cabin or field. Families enduring secret bondage often avoided public testimony, knowing courts and officials rarely sided with them. Their stories risked dismissal as lies or exaggerations. Generations later, descendants recalled experience fragments, a grandmother who had worked fields without pay well into the 1870s or an uncle who remembered hiding when visitors came to the farm. These memories, though painful, became part of Virginia's Black community's hidden heritage. The silence wasn't merely fear-imposed. It also represented survival form. By keeping their suffering unrecorded, numerous families focused on futures in the city, protecting children from dwelling on a stolen past. Yet, written record absence created historical void. What survived were stories passed by word of mouth. Stories reminding us that emancipation wasn't freedom's single moment, but a lengthy struggle carried in voices of those refusing to forget.